All right, everyone, welcome back. Ready for another deep dive. Today, we're tackling something called moderated multiple regression.
Ooh, sounds complicated.
Well, it can be, but it's super useful. It helps us figure out if a third variable is, like, messing with the relationship between two others.
Okay, I'm intrigued. Like what?
So we're looking at this article from '97, Journal of Applied Psychology, by Herman McGinnis.
McGinnis.
Yeah, like the beer. And Eugene F. Stone Romero. They use computer simulations to basically stress test this whole moderated multiple regression thing.
Computer simulation. So like tons of mini experiments all happening inside a computer.
Exactly. They wanted to see what factors could really throw a wrench in the works, make the analysis go wrong.
Smart. What kind of factors are we talking about?
Well, they focused on things you see in almost every study. The total number of people, whether the groups being compared are the same size, and this thing called range restriction.
Range restriction. Rings a bell. Remind me.
Okay, imagine a company uses a test to pick who they're going to hire, but they only hire the people with super high scores.
Right. Makes sense.
So you end up with all this data from the high scores, but you're missing info from the people who didn't do as well on the test.
Ah, okay, I see. So if you're trying to figure out if that test is biased against, let's say, women, but most of the women didn't score high enough to get hired.
You'd never spot the bias because you're missing a chunk of the data.
Exactly. And the study found that even a little bit of range restriction can mess things up, especially if the effect you're looking for, that moderating effect of the third variable, is pretty small.
Wow. So even with a decent sample size, you could still get the wrong answer. What if you only have like 300 people, which is pretty common in a lot of research?
It gets even trickier then. Guinness and Stone Romero found that if your groups are really uneven, like a 90-10 split your chances of finding a real moderating effect, well, they tank, even with 300 people.
So it's not just about having enough people. You've got to worry about these group differences and range restriction.
Yep. And it's not just some statistical quirk. Think about what this means in the real world. Let's say a company uses a study that totally missed a real moderating effect because of these issues. They might end up using a hiring tool that seems fair, but actually puts certain groups at a disadvantage.
Yikes. We're talking about real consequences here, potentially making inequalities worse.
Exactly. And that's why the study is so important. It's like a wake-up call for researchers to be more careful, more critical of their analyses.
Like they're giving us a checklist. Did you check for range restriction? Are your groups balanced? Don't just assume everything's fine.
Absolutely. And here's another layer of complexity they found. These issues don't just act alone. They can interact and make the problems even worse.
Wait, interaction effects. Okay, now I'm really interested. Tell me more.
Imagine you have a small leak in a boat. It's manageable, right? But add a few more leaks and then throw in some rough seas.
You've got a recipe for disaster.
Exactly. It's the same with these statistical issues. They can combine to create a perfect storm of distortion.
So a big sample size might not be enough to save you if there are other problems hiding in your data.
Right. It's a real game changer. We need to be extra vigilant, especially when we're dealing with research that affects people's lives in such a big way.
Absolutely. So we've got sample size, group proportions, range restriction, these tricky interaction effects. What else do we need to watch out for?
This whole study, it was about finding real moderating effects.
Right.
But what about the opposites? Like, what if we think we found something when it's not really there?
Oh, interesting point. You mean those false positives, like saying a hiring test is biased when it's actually totally fine. What causes that to happen?
Yeah, exactly. That's a whole other can of worms, a whole other research question.
Another time.
But getting back to Guinness and Stone Romero, they uncovered yet another layer of complexity.
Hit me with it.
So the relationship between the predictor variable and the moderator, that can also affect how powerful the analysis is.
Okay, hold up. Predictor variable, moderator. Back to our pre-employment test example.
Right. So the predictor could be the scores on that test, and the moderator, let's say, is gender.
Okay, got it.
They found that if those two things, the predictor and moderator, are really strongly correlated,
Oh.
it can make it even harder to spot a true moderating effect.
So it's like you're trying to listen to two people talking at the same time, but they sound almost exactly alike.
Perfect analogy. The more similar they are, the harder to separate, the harder to figure out who's saying what.
So if our test scores are already super connected to, say, how many years of education someone has.
It's going to be really tough to tell if the test is actually biased or if it's just reflecting those differences in education that already exist.
Whoa. Okay, so on top of sample size, the groups, range restriction, those interaction effects. Now, we also have to think about the relationship between the variables themselves. It's a lot.
It is. It's a lot to keep in mind.
Like a giant statistical sundae with all the toppings.
Yeah.
Uh,
But hey, don't let all this scare you away from exploring moderating effects altogether.
right. It's like we wouldn't stop watching movies just because they have plot twists. That's part of the fun.
Exactly. When we find real, true moderating effects, they can teach us so much about how things really work, out in the world. It goes beyond just simple cause and effect.
It's about all the nuances, all the little things that can change how things play out.
Exactly.
Okay, so it's not enough to just get a big sample size and make sure our groups are even. We need to look at the big picture, all the moving parts.
You got it. And that's where it gets really interesting and challenging. But hey, that's what makes research so exciting. It's like a puzzle.
Totally. This deep dive has been incredible.
Right.
I feel like I have a whole new understanding of how powerful this technique is and all the ways it can go wrong.
Me too. And remember, this is just the tip of the iceberg. There's so much more to learn about research methodology.
It's a lifelong journey, right?
Absolutely. The learning never stops.
Well, on that note, let's wrap things up with some key takeaways for our listeners. Okay, so we've been on this journey exploring moderated multiple regression. We've seen how it can help us unravel these really complex relationships, but also all the ways things can go wrong, all the things that can trip us up if we're not super careful.
We talked about sample size, those tricky group differences, that whole range restriction thing, and how all of those can kind of gang up on us and really distort what we're seeing in the data.
And we can't forget about how the variables themselves relate to each other.
Right.
That adds a whole other level of complexity.
Exactly. It's a lot, but it's not about being scared to use this tool. It's powerful. It's about knowing the challenges, knowing what to look for, and taking those steps to make sure we're doing things right.
So for our listeners, what's the big takeaway? What should they be thinking about when they see new research, especially research that might affect their lives in some way?
I think the most important thing is to be a little skeptical. Don't just take the findings at face value, especially if it seems a little too good to be true.
Like, be a detective. Look for the clues. Question the evidence,
You
right?
got exactly. Ask those critical questions. Was the sample size big enough? Were the groups they were comparing actually similar? Was there any range restriction going on? Those little details, they can make a huge difference in whether the conclusions are actually valid.
It's about going deeper, looking past the headlines, and really understanding the methods, how they got those results.
And if you're not sure, if something doesn't seem quite right, don't be afraid to reach out to experts. Look for more information. There are tons of resources out there to help you become a more savvy, more informed consumer of research.
Because at the end of the day, we want research to help us get closer to the truth, right? To make the world better. And that starts with being informed and asking the right questions.
Well said. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the world of moderated multiple regression. Hope you enjoyed it.
And remember, keep thinking critically and never stop exploring. That's what it's all about.